Hello and welcome to the weekly Antelope Node Operators Roundtable call. We're going to discuss the latest updates on the development of the node software that powers EOS, WAX, Telos, which is, of course, Antelope Leap. Today's agenda, so just for context for future folks, this is January 24th. What year is it? 2024? And the agenda is we're going to talk about 5.0 in production. We just released 5.0 stable a few weeks ago now. And of course, block producers and API providers, et cetera, have all been rolling out 5.0 in production for the EOS network and on other Antelope networks. And so we do have some data sort of flowing in little by little on what people are seeing in the real world versus what we sort of intended in design, so that we can see how close to target we are and what improvements we want to make in the future. And if we get through that, we also have a discussion on how we might make it more accessible for less technical folks and non-block producers to run Antelope nodes in the future. So let's start off with the discussion of sort of what we're observing in 5.0 in production. Ross, could you kick us off with some of the observations you mentioned?
Okay, can I share my screen?
Absolutely, if I can figure out how to let you do that.
Right there. I've done
That
it.
looks
I
like
don't know if
good.
it let
Good.
me.
Good.
Okay,
Cool.
all right. Okay, so this is an EOS mainnet node. It's a peer node. It's got between 100 and 190 incoming peers. And those are organic peers. It's not simulated. This is actually on the network. It's our peer one. It's running inside of a VM. It's got 4 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. Now, this is what you're looking at now. This is version 4.04, and this is using 32 gigs of RAM with a 128 gig swap file, and it's running in using TempFS. So it's using the TempFS model. So if you weren't familiar with what the TempFS model is, basically you create a massive TempFS drive, and you put the entire state database manually into that TempFS drive. And what it did is it saved a lot of disk I/O by because it was quite intelligent the way it allocated what was meant to be inside of that folder or that drive into memory as opposed to what was just on disk all the time. So this is version 4. So first of all, we'll just start off with this. This is version 4 using TempFS. Average CPU load was around 70% using those 4 cores. And you can see it's using about 60 odd gigs of RAM. That is like normal for like EOS mainnet. Then on the same node, I then upgraded to version 5, and I'll just jump to version 5, and immediately the RAM was thereabout. Okay, still using the TempFS mechanism, but you can see the CPU drop substantially. Averaging out the CPU, it's about 38% now. So it was halved the CPU load using the same amount of threads and all that config, basically the same config, just using version 5.05. So a big difference in CPU performance is what we spoke about last week. Okay, then I wanted to test. So, and this is still using using TempFS as well. So then I wanted to go and run straight up mapped mode. So I went and ran it up. Is that sorry, moment. Yeah, there. So running it up in map mode, a little bit more CPU utilization, a lot less memory, but a lot of disk I/O, and I'll show you that disk I/O after I've just showed you. When I went to mapped, sorry, when I went to map private mode, you can see that it runs up all of the state database into memory. Now, the state database is over 50 gigs in size. So if you want to run it up on a 32 gig node, you have to give it more swap. Whenever it starts up, it always wants to allocate that entire state database to what it will see as memory. So it managed to use all of the RAM, 30.8 gigs, and then the remainder, it just put it into swap, which is quite a lot. Now, like, okay, so that's the same as how TempFS is. That's all good. When you stop the node would then save all of that memory, state DB memory, onto the actual state file itself. Okay, and it took a bit of time. It took about 15 minutes the first time I did it, but then when I started it up again, it started up immediately without you needing a snapshot, and also it managed to stop really, really quickly. Because it knew everything was in the state database already. It obviously did a check to see what is already on the disk. But what was super interesting is the memory utilization, how the actual memory utilization completely dropped. Now, this is map private mode. So it appears that when you run map private mode the first time around using a snapshot to try and bring it up to speed, it used all the RAM and swap like it would typically do using the TempFS strategy. However, subsequent restarts, it was intelligently only putting what needed to be in RAM. And I let it run for ages, and it didn't seem to go back to that huge footprint, which was pretty good. So summary so far is CPU utilization is better, whether you use mapped or map private mode using version 5. And the map private mode is using less RAM than the TempFS solution after you restart it. But the real winner, and this is Michael's favorite, is disk IO. So this is mapped disk IO running on EOS mainnet when there's about 5 to 10 transactions a second. You're looking at an average. I averaged it out over a few hours. It's somewhere around 4 to 5 megabytes a second of IO. Okay, so actual data. So that'll be like 160 terabytes of write a year. So if you just had like a cheapy consumer SSD, it'll probably smash your SSD in 2 years, right? I mean, 300 terabytes. I mean, you get like a nice Samsung, maybe it'll give you 600. So in 4 years, it would completely destroy the disk as far as the endurance goes, just straight up. And this is on a slow, quiet EOS mainnet when I was doing this testing. Like I said, 10 transactions a second. I haven't done the same testing on Wax using both mechanisms like this, but I'll show you. But I want to then show you what map private does. Map private is in the kilobytes. Sorry, you can see I'm actually on disk read. Disk read is 34 kilobytes. It's like half of that. So it literally does not touch the disk at all, anywhere near as much as it would do if it was just map mode. So there's some straight up information there. Sure, you could say, I run an EOS node, there's only 10 transactions a second, it's going to last me 4 years on my SSD. But what if you had more than one instance running on that server or that PC or whatever it is? It doesn't matter which way you look at it. Running without intelligent memory provisioning, it's silly for your disks. You might as well just add this map private mode. The fact that you don't have to run it up with a snapshot anymore every single time you reboot the machine is great. Oh yes, one thing that you must be aware of is that you have to make sure that you've got the space on your disk. So you need 128 gigs of swap file for EOS, for instance. So it actually needs 128 gigs, and it needs 128 gigs for the database as well. You know what I mean? Because it needs to run it up into memory, into the swap memory if it's needed to, and then and then leave, and then the database needs to be however big the data. I mean, the database has been provisioned, sure, but it's already 50, 60 gigs or whatever it is on EOS. So like you would need, instead of getting away with 128 gig disk for your state and operating system, as in my previous guides, you need to make like double that, just to make sure that you can save the data, because it's not running in the state database on disk anymore. It's only just using that as a save repository type thing. I'm going to be writing an article on this. I need to actually update my building like a rock solid mainnet node. Inside there, I spoke about putting your blocks data onto a SATA disk or a SAS disk, something that's nice and big and easy scalable, and then your state stuff on the SSD. And then I said, look, if you really want to save your SSDs, you need to be doing TempFS. I'm going to be migrating to map private, because from what I see, it's the same benefit of TempFS, except I don't have to keep running a snapshot every time I reboot the node, and that's kind of cool. So yeah, I thought that you'd be interested in that findings, real info. And wow, the CPU usage, what a difference, eh?
Hey Ross, this is I'm sorry, were you done? Go ahead.
Oh, that's it. Good job on the CPU. That's brilliant.
Yeah, hey, thanks so much. That was really great. I'm glad that you were able to get us all that information. One small comment there about the map private from the snapshot. It's a little bit more complicated, but you could always, when you're loading the snapshot, run in mapped mode, shut down and restart in map private, and then you kind of get the best in both worlds. Now,
okay, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, ideally, we might look at trying to do that automatically. Like when you start from a snapshot, just use map mode, and then as soon as it's done, switch over to map private. Without you having to actually do a physical restart. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the problem, the issue with map private with snapshot is you're touching all the data, obviously, because you've got to read it all in, and that's why it's that's why you're seeing what you're seeing there. But yeah, man, that's some really great results. Thanks.
Yeah, a lot of people would be resistant to throwing the massive swap in there, but just throw it in. And those swaps are just file swaps. I didn't even create a special partition or anything. I don't think it matters anymore. On SSD, you just put the data. It's not like it's going to get fragmented like a spinning disk anymore. So it's not an issue. So it's easy to make a big swap just on whatever server you've got.
Yeah, Ross, thanks for showing all these results. We knew it was better, but it wasn't clear how much better it was until you start actually showing the data. So, as I was doing testing, I kept upgrading, little pieces as we go. So I didn't have that big, I went from 4 to 5 thing, right? Because I was doing these, patch this and try that. So
the thing is,
to see this.
You've also got to do it on a node that's getting smashed out the face, right?
Yeah, because if the node is not busy, then
it's hard to see. Yeah.
It's got to have a big state database, which is only a couple of them. It really needs to see some real abuse and load. So
yeah.
So I'll be doing the same testing on Wax when I get to it. Wax obviously got many more transactions, and that's the thing that hits all those little writes in that state database, right? So that should really be a big difference. Like I said to you on the call last week, I've seen like 100 megabytes of write continuous before. It must have been on Wax, I think.
Yeah, so it's interesting, I think probably it bears spending time when you write your article on the shutdown. So you didn't put a chart, of the disk write. So when you shut down, obviously it's going to do a huge disk write, because now it has to write everything in memory that was there. And the longer your node runs, the more it needs to write, right? So if you just start it and stop it, it stops immediately because there was nothing changed, right? But the longer you let it run, the more things have changed and the longer it will take to write to disk.
That's actually a good point.
So so people need to know to expect a variable amount of time on shutdown depending on the amount of time the node was running. So
yeah. Okay, I get it. Cool. But I mean, that wasn't. I would totally take that over having to run a snapshot every time.
Oh yeah, for
sure. Yeah.
No, but it is good to note that, because you're right. I mean, if you say you're on Wax and you've been running for 3 months, yeah, that shutdown probably don't take a while.
3 months, man, we got 12 months, 15.
What?
Yeah, or, or 3 years, but at that point, you think you're on the right out, probably most of it at that point. I'm sure there's regions in there that don't ever get touched ever, but, yeah.
This one here, it had been up for 176 days. So like
Yeah.
6 months, right?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta understand, state history knows we just kind of let go because you don't like breaking the WebSocket or some things don't. A lot of things are better at it. I can give you my perspective from the pleb map mode side of things and what we've seen. I'm curious if anybody else has done Frost level investigation and statistics. Well done, Kangaroo, well done. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean, I think there's something to be said about, and maybe that's why, we keep it the default is that, if you're just wanting to run a node, and you're not a node operator like that's on this call, then yeah, you prefer the start and stop that's quick, and you're just syncing up to a network, and yeah, your SSD is getting a bit of pounding, but I mean, that's not probably your greatest concern. So yeah, there's obviously pros and cons to all these different modes.
Well, I'm super happy the team came up with the map private. So I don't know what the background was, how that came to be. I like to think I poked enough people that that caused some discussion, but
I'm
Yeah,
gonna give credit.
I
Stan and
can't
his-
remember. I had absolutely nothing to
defense.
do with it, so it was not me. Greg did did all the heavy lifting there. I can't remember if it was Matt or Greg that actually came up with the idea, but yeah, those are your guys you need to be thinking. I had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I think Greg did all the work there really, and then I think Matt might have put some finishing touches on it or something too to I don't know, seal it in, if you will.
anyway, those running on AWS will be super thankful because now you can actually run it on AWS and not get IO limited. So this was one of the reasons I was poking on this disk IO thing, because we have certain, what do you call it, exchanges or other entities that insist on running things on public cloud infrastructure, which is not friendly to that many write operations.
And it was more the disk IO that throttled
totally
it,
the disk
more
IO.
so than the shared CPU or
Yeah,
any
for
of
sure.
that other nonsense.
Correct.
Interesting. I've never tried, but
yeah, because like I don't know about you, but like I've spun up nodes on Google Cloud before. The first thing I do is do like apt update to apply all the security updates, and the first thing it does is like apply the Google Cloud apt image, which then takes like half an hour because it runs out of disk writes, and then the thing buffers until it can actually finish. So like Google Cloud is unusable on Google Cloud. It's like, guys, who come up with this design? But anyway, yeah, it's all just limiting you on disk writes, so everything stalls. It's ridiculous.
So it would be interesting to get an update as you guys keep going. This is great. It's really good to hear this feedback. But like, Ross, like, does that allow you now to go from 200 configured connections to 400 configured connections on a single node? What's the new limit on?
why stop at 200, man? Come on.
I mean, well, that's what I'm curious about. Like, where is the new kind of stopping point? I think you guys have said in the past somewhere around 200 is kind of the max number of allowed connections. Above that, things start kind of falling apart. But
I haven't looked in a while. Yeah,
I
I
was
just
gonna
kind of
say,
said it
wow.
there.
that
Yeah.
came from a long time ago recommendation of probably like nations being like, yo, eventually shit just falls over after about 200. I mean, it's hard to get 200 organic peer-to-peer connections, consistently, and it not be your real public node. Interesting, we've seen a little bit of a difference in relation to the peer-to-peer side of things. I don't know if it's just related to the updates or what, but I don't know. Is it my turn to give an update from the normie side of things?
Yes, go ahead.
I didn't hack things up. I didn't run map private. I'd say
It's not a
I,
hack, it's part of the code now, bro. It's part of the
that's true.
operating
That's
system.
true. I call the temp FS, whatever. And I still argue that $100 SSD drive is cheaper than the 512 gig of RAM I'm gonna need for, you know, monstrosity of all these chains. But that's more of a me versus it's an awesome feature. I'm excited. I'm gonna start playing with it more.
I
am
mean,
excited
map
about it.
private, you just need a bigger disk, as Ross said, because you just need space for the swap.
And memory, you gotta have all the memory
No.
available.
No, you
No.
don't.
obviously.
No,
No,
you
you
don't.
don't.
You don't.
Oh,
The swap
you
is the
could
accessible
say-
memory.
Yeah.
It's just gonna be a bit
That's
slower.
that's the beauty of it.
And but it doesn't actually swap hard. I mean,
No,
No,
it doesn't
Well,
swap
whatever's
hard.
whatever's used, it keeps in memory, and if it's not used, it just leaves it on the swap.
I'll try it out. That's what I say. I like the idea. Whenever I heard about it, I was like, huh, that's interesting. I just got burned because my chain state DB is through the roof. And that led to a whole different discussion.
Yeah,
Whatever.
so you need to make sure you have enough RAM to cover your entire chain state DB size, whatever that is.
Correct.
Enough
That's-
RAM, including swap.
Correct.
Yeah,
correct,
and swap.
correct.
Yeah.
So that's
It's
what I
memory,
say.
not
I
RAM.
can't
Like
be-
Yeah,
you need
it's
access to addressable memory that could be in the form of RAM or a swap file or a swap partition.
correct.
Yeah.
Well, as long as it's not heavy swapping, you're fine. But
Yeah, so as
But
long as the
that's
chain
the
is
thing,
not
yeah.
using more active RAM than whatever RAM you're actually using.
I just
right.
always hear swap and I cringe because, I mean,
I don't know. We
But that's
use
the
you
swap.
point
use it,
Darren
it's
is
not
making,
normally a
is like
good
you're
thing,
not gonna
but-
swap. Like you're
Correct.
only gonna see a degradation if there is a swap. And
Correct, I
OSs
get
are
it.
smart enough not to swap unless they need to.
I get it.
Yeah.
I
You
just
can
need
always
to try.
Well, as
You
long
can
as it's
always-
not Windows, but yeah,
Well, that's why I say, remember, my background is
That's not
Microsoft, so
Windows.
I was trying to avoid saying that the first time around. Is swap is, ooh, yeah, Windows
I
smash
know.
shit.
But you
Yeah.
can play around with the swappiness level as well in Linux, right? To tell it how much to swap out.
Ooh, I
versus-
don't know if you want EOS USA under the hood messing with swappiness, but all
But
that being said,
The default swappiness seems to be fine. So
I'll give it a shot. Like I say, I just haven't had a chance to tackle it, tell it enough to update 150, 200 nodes as is. What we've mostly seen, disk IOP, and again, we didn't change from default mapped, is about the same. A wax node smashing about 2000 IOPS on, pretty steady, obviously smashing the state DB. The other public chains, EOS and a bunch of the other ones, much less. What I have seen since 5.0 is more spiking of disk IOPS. I don't know why, but it was pretty consistent before. Like even if it was API, if it was private, public, whatever, it was pretty consistent. But now you can definitely see that at certain times it's using the disk more intensive. Now it's a NVMe, so I mean it doesn't really
Do
bat
you
an
have
eye.
do you have everything on one disk, or do you put your blocks on it? When you say IOPS, which is that state and blocks?
It's mostly state. All my yeah, pretty much all my blocks or state history logs or any of that is over on a bigger SSD or SATA disk, but NVMe is OS and state and config files, right? That's our default. So, but interesting, like I say, I can go back over 90 days of the same node doing the same role, and you can see it was flat line, same load. Since 5.0, it has definitely started to see some increases. I'm not.
But has the average decreased? Is the average less, but now there is more spikes, or the average is the same? And in addition, you have spikes.
The latter. The average is about the same, and I see more occasional spikes. And again, I could show you different, scattered all over different graphs, but
Well,
just
if
as
you've got all-
holistic.
run up one of your nodes, make it map private, and you'll see that suddenly all of the spikes are gone, and it's just
Well, I mean,
blah.
before it was like, I mean, I don't really notice any difference, but that 5.0 definitely is using the disk more. Not that it's a bad thing. I can see about that timeline whenever I shifted things over to 5.0, the node's role hasn't changed, and chains haven't changed that much. It's just the IOPS start to increase a little bit more, which is fine. I mean, and again, I'm running in map private, or I'm running in mapped. Map private obviously would help a lot better with the memory management. In relation to CPU usage, it's down a little bit. I mean, I don't have all the different threads and tracking each one independent bench line. I'm more just kind of looking at, my performance graphs. It's been doing the same thing forever. Config changed a little bit in the aspect of just pulling it back to defaults, where before it may have had a bunch of, legacy. Well, default doesn't work. It's got to be higher, but for the most part, CPU usage has slid down a little bit. I mean, it wasn't like it was smashing or pegging out any threads. It's just maybe 5-10% lower on the graphs, it looks like. I do see my peer-to-peer traffic has decreased dramatically. And these were going from 4.0 nodes to 5.0 nodes. Now, I can't tell, like, it's almost like I lost a substantial amount of inbound peer-to-peer. I actually sent Darwin a message and was like, hey, did I break something? You seeing my peer-to-peers screaming about not working? But my total peer-to-peer counts that I track aren't nearly as high, although the bandwidth that they're providing seems to have decreased dramatically. I mean, we always talked about how it seemed extra chatty, even still on 4.0, I think. 5.0, I
Would
think.
that be due to the optimization in 5.0 and like deciding who to peer with? And so basically, if other people upgraded to 5, there might be less demand on your node because they're going to their closest peer or something of that effect.
The number of peers dropping, I think, is self-induced. I like I say, I don't know if it's the proxy, the node settings, or what, but it was instantaneous that it dropped. But like I say, it just seems that the peer-to-peer drop, it definitely isn't symmetrical like it used to be, right? It used to be you ripping out 100 megabit, you're getting in 100 megabit. I can definitely see, I think it's more outbound that I tend to be doing.
I noticed that as well with 5. You actually asked the question a few months back. Why is our in and out the same?
Yeah, right.
Where it
It's
shouldn't be.
symmetrical.
It shouldn't be. And ours is definitely not anymore.
Correct.
So
And I think it was still that way in 4 a little bit. I think it maybe had gotten better, but 5.0, I noticed a dramatic decrease in bandwidth on my public peer-to-peer nodes. I also noticed, I mean, it went from 200 to 100, right? I mean, it went from, I don't know, 125 down to 50, right? And that's why I'm like, I don't know why. I don't really have the peer limits. I don't know if whatever. We'll see how it all plays out. But the whole point is, it does seem like the bandwidth of my peer-to-peer nodes has gone down. Inversely, it looks like the bandwidth on my API nodes has 5 or 6 times over. Now, CPU utilization is actually down probably 10-15%. I probably have a few more read threads, and I haven't done a whole bunch of tweaking of the endpoints, but you can definitely see whenever I started flipping those API nodes over to 5.0, there is a substantial amount more of outbound traffic. It may be probably better at serving get tables or blocks. One of the two.
One of those two is just, it's more efficient at, and that's why the bandwidth increases, because people can slurp the stuff faster out of your
correct.
API.
So, but the good news is I don't see extra IOPS, anything more than I see across all my other nodes and private nodes and stuff like that, right? So it's spewing out this extra information, but I have not seen any increase in disk, really memory utilization, or even CPU, because it looks like it has gone down a little bit in the average overall CPU utilization. So those are a few of the just general things I've seen. For the most part, like I say, it's mostly status quo, but I didn't do the memory change, and I'm using a lot of the defaults. Let's try going back to that and see how it works.
So all good news all around. I'm not hearing any problems here.
No, I've had some unlinkable blocks, but those have been on just as many 4.0 nodes as they have 5.0. I'm still not.
That's just Michael's infrastructure.
It happens. It happens. And my internet. I'll tell you about all that. My generator
yesterday,
my internet.
Yesterday, your internet booked or something because I got.
I was there with the electricians. I was
It's
doing
late
that.
on everything. Every chain, there's a
We
blip.
figured out, hey, we figured out when the weekly generator test kicked in, it actually tripped the battery backup that controlled one of the Fortinets that took out one of the sync nodes. I mean, it was this whole daisy chain I had to chase down yesterday. Anyway, long story short, yes, hopefully I've got it fixed and getting it
Yeah,
going,
well,
but the
thanks
generator
for all the
self-test.
alerts, dude. Because
You know
whenever
how
your thing goes blip, I get an alert.
You want to know what my phone was looking like? I showed it to the electricians. I'm like, this is why it's so bad. The wall of Aloha alerts. So, yes.
All right.
Anyway, that's how it's been going, but it's going pretty good, pretty smooth.
Yeah, everybody keep the updates coming as we hit new contexts here, you know, other chains or, you know, different traffic patterns, whatever, right? So yeah, thanks.
Anyway, please send our heartfelt thanks back to the engineering team.
Yeah, I'm actually
for
gonna
excellent work.
tell the team and Greg in particular that they should watch the beginning of this video once we have it posted. So but yes, we'll do. Excellent. All right. Next topic we have on the agenda is discussion around how we might make it easier and more accessible for non-block producers to be running nodes.
Can I jump in? Oh,
Yeah.
with one more thing. So one thing that didn't get tested and hopefully wouldn't get tested is when you're running in mapped private mode, it does check to see if you're running out of memory. And when that happens, it's going to start trying to write out. It's going to tell the operating system to start writing out to disk to try to free up memory. And when it does that, we're not sure how it's going to react because it's really hard to test. And it may not even impact nodeos. It may impact something else that's running on the disk that the OS decides isn't a priority to have in memory.
Well, I was running out of memory in that second one. I had 32 gigs of RAM and used all the RAM and then used the swap. And that was when I first ran up map private with a snapshot. So it ran out and it did its thing. It was still fine, no problem.
I think he means if it runs out of memory in total, like even if like there was not enough swap, right?
Not enough swap as well.
Yeah, not enough swap as well. Just to let you know how it's running, and there's many different options on how to fine tune this thing. So on how to fine tune memory pressure, right? It's OS dependent. There's some application stuff that we can do. So there was a big debate on how we should structure that correctly, and we ended up deciding to use a particular flag. It looks at like 90%, 90+%. That watermark may not be in the right place. So I'm just saying that if you're getting really a lot of memory pressure, we would love to know how that worked and if there's anything that we should tune on that.
I don't think we ever merged that change.
There was always one that Greg had in there.
Oh, is there? Okay.
Yeah. There's always one that Greg had in there, and then there's a recommended change by Matt. I thought maybe you're right, but then there's a recommended change by Matt to update that.
Yeah, there's a big PR discussion. Now this never got merged. I don't know if there's another one, current one in there or not. I didn't think so, but like if you want to follow along on a very techie discussion, you can read that thread.
Anyways, just putting that out there as you run map private mode, if you do run out of swap or memory.
Hopefully we don't run out.
So I should build an 8 gig node and just spin up EOS. Tell me 8 gig swap and just launch it.
Sounds like a challenge.
I can run wax.
You're gonna have to basically increase the state of the chain, right? Like to trigger it, you're gonna have to have a chain that's already filling up the RAM.
Yeah, EOS is already filling up the RAM.
That's what I was saying. Launch an EOS node. I mean, I can do wax too, but that's just painful.
We have RAM mining on EOS, right?
Just launching that's a 20 gig snapshot file these days. Damn, I'd rather do EOS. Anyway. 50 gigs. Nothing. It's half a wax.
All right. Well, now back to the other. Sorry, Ryan. Now
Yeah,
back to the other topic of.
No problem.
Like-
Good note. Good note. All right. Yeah. So where was I? Oh yeah. So basically, how might we make it easier and or more accessible for non-block producers to run Antelope nodes? For the purposes of scoping the discussion, just as a starting point, let's say on EOS. I know that for the most part it's similar across other networks, but of course different
I
requirements.
think the first point to look at is the main functionality that this thing will offer. So if one of those functionalities is self-updating, then we're talking now about like a wrapper or like some type of piece of software that is managing node EOS. And if you have that kind of piece of software, it can do everything else from stuff you discussed like auto pitching configs or auto updating or like having it, as I suggested before, like expose a web server where you can click config what options you want from like simple UI from a browser on the same network as a machine. Or so there's different ways to do that, but I think it starts with first, what is the functionality, or what do you want to enable by that?
Yeah, I think even one step before that, a good question would be, what is the most likely, most common use case that this easy mode sort of thing would like, why would somebody be running this in the first place, right?
Developer,
launching a
for
node.
sure. Like
Sorry, a few went at once. Let's go one at a time. I think I saw Shaq was one of the folks that was speaking.
I was just saying, like a developer is like a prime example of somebody who wants to develop, run something on their own where they don't need to deal with this whole like power up or figure out what I need to charge or buy a ton of RAM to test his contract or run on a test node that could be sometimes unreliable or hard to get tokens for to even do anything. So I think that's like a prime example. Somebody wants to boot up like a node right away and wants to start playing with smart contracts and test them and running it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the question of, is it that in experience? I guess the way I understood it, and of course I'm a node operator, is that you've already identified or think you've identified the reason you want to run a node. The same reason you think you identify you want to run an ETH node, right? For whatever reason brings you to that purpose. Now, running an ETH node is basically launch geth, let it rip, enable a few parameters, use the service you want. But I mean, being able to launch it and have your own development environment and chain stuff like that, that's a different experience, maybe Doom or whatever. But I guess I thought you meant something in my head would be Leap Util. We already have that. It does a lot of that wrapper outside of NodeOS anyway, to be able to generate a config based off of what role you need, which is mostly API / peer-to-peer. You can almost roll them together. State history, you could even do trace API or some of these, because the exchanges are going to want to do those. But there's those few key roles that we talked about that now I think it's a lot easier to give a default config. I mean, there's not really a lot of extra options to just say,
right, but for
go run Leap
exchanges,
Util and say, generate config for an API. And it'd be like, "All right, boss, I got you. Brink, here's the plugins, here's account queries, here's transaction retries." So number one is the config. And then number two is really the peering, which those are the two things I would say compared to the ETH node. Once you know you need a node, what's the 95% use case? All of them are dApps or somebody that's trying to interact with the chain. You don't do it because you want to make money, right? You're running it because you typically, most people, 95%, whatever. You want to smash arbitration bots in, whatever. It's an API node, a basic node. It just needs to launch, sync to the chain, and service peer-to-peer / API transactions. Or there are some other specialized configs, trace API, state history, things like that, that you could then say, oh, you want one of those? Well, okay, here's these extra parameters. But that's different than what Shaq was kind of describing, which is the developer onboarding experience, I think. Which one are you looking for?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm asking the question. Another one that comes to mind for me is exchanges who want a a trustworthy, rock solid, under their own control way to get balances and sort of send transactions and whatnot, but don't necessarily, like, EOS is one of 1,000 things that they're running. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's why the trace API was kind of built. I don't know what all of them are using, but that would probably be, and I think it's really manually configurable, is a blessing or a curse. So yeah, the config option would be like, oh, you want to enable the trace API? Cool. I need you to tell me the contracts that I need to monitor, and kind of walk them through it, and then build the trace API configs and have the node launch and be like, oh, you're looking for, what is that, Coinbase space? Spit out all of the transactions that are related to that. I think is how that works. Again, I don't directly support a lot of exchanges, but they may have other mechanisms. But I think the trace API and being able to walk them through that again, right? It's not just enable it and let it rip, right? You have to provide some additional configuration. Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, or whoever knows it better, but I know Aaron uses it a lot, and I think exchanges do, but a utility, a wrapper, whatever, that would at least provide the ability to be like, I'll give you a good starting point.
Yeah, some of the other things too, I think Matthew might have a perspective here on whether this is sort of relevant or not. What about sort of like data indexers? So obviously you don't really fit into the bucket of folks who are like, not involved in EOS, but might be interested in indexing EOS related data, right? Because you're indexing, but you're obviously involved in the EOS ecosystem. I'm just wondering if that's one that, for example, if on the GraphQL ecosystem, if we wanted more people from that ecosystem to be running, I'm going to butcher the terminology, but running services for EOS, would we first need to make this easier for that to be realistic?
Okay, so that's an interesting question, because I was in a discussion yesterday on exact similar topic. It was like, we want to onboard blockchain X into the graph ecosystem, and we need docs, and how is this maintained, and how are indexers, so the indexers is the node operators of the graph, how is all this stuff going to be maintained? So the answer is, it's up to each chain to provide the details about how to run the stuff. So anything you can do to make it easier to run stuff for people who aren't familiar with the ecosystem, the better, right? So if nodeos -- config for indexers.
Yeah.
Now I don't have to think about anything. I just know to pass this command line and it does everything, right? Okay, we don't have to make it that simple, because indexers are technical people. They're comfortable editing YAML file or whatever. But the idea is download a snapshot here, download the config here. You have to provide them the exact recipe,
right?
Because they don't have time to think about what they need to do.
Expanding on some of that, I mean, so really, at least in my mind, I mean, I guess there's a couple other mechanisms, but there's three main, I don't know, almost fire hoses out of antelope chains that can be used effectively to index, read, I mean, REST API and GET actions only work so far or whatever, right? But you've got diffuse, which is mind reader, right? It pumps it out and it basically takes all this extra data and says, here you go. State history, which does similar, but obviously not nearly as efficient. And then the variation of trace API, which I think is the opposite. It only gives you what you want, but, and then of course there's other ways to get data, but what we found, at least most of the application layer twos, as I call them, right? What sits on top of the blockchain and slurps data and then figures out what to do with it, right? Fact number one, that it comes out serialized has always brutalized everybody, right? I mean, the good news, there are more libraries that are developed that are able to, I know Sweden's releasing one to be able to deserialize and kind of, you know, close the loop on here's your fire hose out, here it is in readable damn data without having to figure everything out. But you basically have state history, diffuse, or trace API, all which have their own respective reasons for using them.
Mm-hmm.
And then people build chronicles or mementos or Hyperions or atomic APIs or whatever it is to be able to use the data on top of it. So an indexer in Matthew's terms is basically firing up a node and saying, I need to get a shitload of data out of it, more than normal. Like I would fire up an Ethereum node and say, hey, guess what? I don't just need the RPC node. I need the WebSocket node to load on this parameter as well. And it just launches and picks the default port, right? So the ability for them to say, I need a state history node or an indexer node or whatever you want to name it, and it just pick the default settings, throw it out there, and let you tweak it as you want, I think is important, right? I mean, an API node, a data indexer node, which is basically API and peer-to-peer is, and all the extra API endpoints, right? And then state history is just a few of these extra plugins, a few parameters.
So I think like one of the discussions we had last week was that, you know, we were talking about read-only threads or producer threads or whatever. And there's some discussion, well, if it's this kind of node, then it should be configured this way. If it's this kind of node, it should be configured that way. And, you know, the operators among us always cringe because it's like, okay, now we have to create a config file for this and a config file, right? Can't we just, if we could have some base starting points, right?
Mm.
Then it would set those parameters that need to be different on the different kinds, and then we can customize. But then it avoids us, you know, having to, you know, start by customizing every single node because the default doesn't work for anything, right?
Correct. That's right. I mean, you've got this default set, and then you've got between 2 and 12 extra parameters, which at least we're finding, and I think that y'all would agree, it's much easier to go with the default parameters now. So it doesn't require a whole bunch of crazy, oh, it's a public chain? Yeah, 30 milliseconds is a stupid default timeout. Things like that, right?
Yeah, so it's getting better for sure. Right, but how do we take it to the next level where we can just say, okay,
there are
start with the defaults that a X kind of node would do, and then we'll customize it from there.
Correct. And also, like I say, I mean, the fact that state history has the term history in it and gets constantly confused with
V1 history,
real history, V1, V2, Hyperion, whatever. Oh, that's so miserable because I can't tell you how many have gone, now, yeah, of course I need a state history server. Why doesn't /history work? Ha! Oh man, you just started.
Well,
so
that
anyway,
comes back to whether we should remove the history commands out of Kleos.
But no, it's far beyond that. It's purely semantics. Is that it's if it weren't called state history and history, it probably wouldn't be confusing. But that's down the road. We are where we are. The second piece I would say on that is just like Ethereum. You specify a few things. Now, either it's generate a default configuration or literally you just launch Geth with the parameters, few parameters you want and rock and roll. Secondly, and I know Matthew's been big on this and he's absolutely right, peer management. And I'll even roll in snapshotting just because, hey, yo, don't launch from Genesis. That's almost impossible. You know, so those two things, in my mind, are the most critical. the ability to more streamline at least the starting point to say an API, a state history, trace API, because we know exchanges, hey, ask maybe a whatever. And then boom, it fires off a default config. Boom, it goes out and at least tries to find peers, because that's a more easily, right? Here's a list,
Yeah,
go
so
get them. And
know,
then
the-
even
the
maybe
boot
snapshot
nodes.
launching, you know, I mean, kind of rolling that in as an expansion, but.
Right, so really we need a specification for what is a boot node. So like in Ethereum land, you know, typically the chains have the configuration for where to boot from configured into the software. So you just say, hey, I'm launching a Ethereum mainnet node, and then it knows to go grab the stuff from over here. Not that I like that too much, because that feels kind of centralized in a decentralized world, but it makes it easy to start a node. Right, so it can find the list of peers, it can find your Genesis file, it can find, you know, I don't know, whatever it needs.
I think it's key to be able to have that option. You don't have to do it. It's not a
Yeah, you don't have
requirement
to use
that you
it. You
have
can
to.
provide all the details, but
Correct.
you know,
But yes, I
I think
mean,
we have discussed like first, like the role for an exchange is very different than a lot of different users. That like said previously, the exchange wants to run their own node because they're going to rely on these transactions to send their own funds or do something else. So it has to be their own node. They also want some type of history. It's not like it just has to be some live block that they have to query on the second, or else they lose that information. So really what I think exchanges would need is, yes, something that's automatically configurable with all the bells and whistles, like we talked about, auto config, auto all these items. But more importantly, they also need some type of baked in history solution that will be able to have some type of history that's automatically cleared. Say like say in Trace API, you have like, you can define where past what lib you don't want to keep. So something that auto cleans, and ideally something that can even filter the data for them, only the data they want to keep. That'll be something that makes it much easier for exchanges to just have it running, write their software once to consume this data and never have to worry about it again. Self updates of everything, and they're just communicating with that history built-in solution that gets maintained with reverse, you know, with backward compatibility, obviously.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to look at
also
this
say
the
that's
opposite
probably-
way for a second.
that's probably 3% of the user base that we found on throughout all of our chains that run nodes, right? So while I do agree it's something important and a config maybe can help them and streamline it, in my opinion, it's like on ETH. 95% of the Geth nodes out there running aren't exchanges. They're apps or somebody that's just integrating with the chain, the builders, the runners. You know? So,
right here, but the reason is what we're trying to do here. I think part of this interest in the project, at least from the ENF side, seems to me, from what's been said by Yves on the call when he came, when we first introduced the idea, and in the follow-up calls, it seems exchanges are a big part of it. And it's actually a big part of EOS's future in general. And it's not the main exchanges that have a lot of people, it's these smaller exchanges that for them, it's not worth it to maintain necessarily like a blockchain that doesn't get much volume. So even though they might be like a small percentage of the nodes, these nodes, to maintain them or to have them running, might be much more detrimental or important for EOS itself.
I don't disagree at all. But from what we've seen, most exchanges are not identically the same. Most of them have their own slight variation. They have their own rules. You're right. It has to be their own node. It has to be layer 1, can't be layer 2, but they all have their own, you know, requirements and nuances. So that's why I tend to kind of generalize them in a bucket. Absolutely. I think that the config mechanism needs to try to do a better job. I use Trace API as an example. Fine. Here's what most exchanges use. Here's the questions we need to ask you. Here's a guide for how you should ingest this Trace API that we let you set up. I agree we need to focus and streamline on it. But when you actually look at, as we help hundreds and hundreds of people throughout the years set up all these nodes, who was it? It was a dApp developer. It was somebody was using public infrastructure, and for some reason they can't or decide that they don't need to or want to. So streamlining That to me is more what the wizard, if we can knock out 95% of them and then focus on, okay, well, what else does the 5% need in this wrapper? I think that's a more successful strategy, because now at least you can say 95% of the people that are exposing and building on their chain aren't ripping their freaking hair out or having to get charged 2 pinkies for me to run a damn node for them, because it's
right. But this comes back to like kind of,
specialized.
in a sense, business priorities, I would say. You know, for example, it might be much more important for you to focus on that 3%. And it doesn't mean the software dies and doesn't get updates after. Then the same mechanisms that will work for that can be expanded to accommodate the rest. But you have to start somewhere. And it seems like that was the most pressing reason. Like, as you said, others who want to run a node for whatever, a DApp or something, they're going to find their way around. You know, like they asked you, or we can have better documentation. All that stuff is fine. It's the people you want to use your node, or you want them to run nodes, even though they might not be interested in. That's kind of, I think, was part of that direction, is how do you make it so easy that they can just keep it running and not kind of reconsider every time there's a fork.
That level of customization for an exchange is an extremely tough task to define, even, in my opinion, as a standard. They don't even have a standardization. And again, you know, it's analysis paralysis. You'll spend so long
what to
trying
focus
to
on the software for the first parts, right? Like the features that you want to focus on, I would say, depends on why the ENF wants to do it.
Right.
But if part of the reason is keeping like the exchanges, you know, in case they want to bail, then that should be the priority. That's the main thing. If no exchanges have EOS on it, guess what's going to happen to the developers? You know, they're not going to exist.
It sounds like y'all want to focus on streamlining the onboarding process for those types of experiences. I'm down, but that's a much harder nut to crack, to define. And guess what? You're leaving 95% of the people that are trying to launch the nodes and cussing them out on the doorstep. But it's not my call to make. But that was the original question to you. What's your intended goal?
Right.
You can build an app or a wrapper.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
one way or other,
they're just different.
Just to make it clear.
Yeah, exactly. Things can build on each other. I agree with that. I think it's choices, not necessarily obvious choices. I think, to Shaq's point, part of the concern with exchanges is there, you know, that EOS is just one of many, right? And therefore we have to have some hesitance with how frequently we would do like breaking or consensus changes and those sorts of things. And so the easier we can make those sorts of things, the better for them. That's not to say that they are more important. It's just a consideration as we decide and prioritize. We are at time, so I do want to end it here. One sort of like just thought thing I'll leave with folks is just looking at this the other way, and we won't get into this discussion now, but it might be a starting point. You know, we're saying for non-BPs, and so another thought is just, okay, well, what are the complicated parts of being a BP that become irrelevant if we're not, you know, that could be leveraged to make this easier, right? Well, if it's not a BP, they don't have to worry about X, Y, and Z, and therefore, you know, we can kind of abstract those or even take away choices in the way of, you know, making it easier. But I'll leave it there for now. Thanks everybody for joining in the discussion. Just as a quick summary, you know, we saw some pretty graphs and charts. Thanks, Ross, and heard from other folks as well. Thanks, Michael, and everyone else who spoke up about 5.0 sort of results so far in production, with some really you know, promising results. It seems like it's a good idea to upgrade to 5.0 if you haven't already, and look out for Ross's upcoming article, which will give some best practices from his observations as well. And then we also, talked a little bit about who we might want to make nodeos easier for and ways we could do that. We will continue that discussion over the coming weeks, obviously interrupting it as other more urgent things might come up. But thanks again and have a good week.